What happens when a seasoned television journalist refuses to let a high-profile political figure dodge the tough questions? The tension in the studio was palpable, as George Stephanopoulos prepared to grill Pam Bondi on the most controversial aspects of her political career. What started as a routine interview quickly spiraled into one of the most heated confrontations ever captured on live television. Before we dive into this explosive exchange, make sure to subscribe and let me know in the comments what you think about politicians who try to evade direct questions. The interview began with what seemed like standard pleasantries, but Stephanopoulos wasted no time cutting through the political rhetoric. His first question landed like a precision strike, immediately putting Bondi on the defensive about her record as Florida's Attorney General. Let's talk about your decision to join the multi-state lawsuit challenging the Affordable Care Act. Stephanopoulos opened, his voice calm but pointed. You argued that the entire law should be struck down, which would have eliminated protections for people with pre-existing conditions. How do you reconcile that position with your current claims that you've always supported healthcare protections for vulnerable Americans? Bondi shifted slightly in her chair, her media training evident as she attempted to pivot away from the specifics. George, what I've always supported is affordable healthcare for all Americans. The lawsuit was about constitutional overreach, not about taking away people's healthcare. We believed there were better ways to achieve healthcare reform that didn't involve federal mandates, but Stephanopoulos wasn't having it. He leaned forward slightly, his journalist instincts taking over. But Pam, that's not what you said at the time. In multiple interviews, you specifically stated that the individual mandate was unconstitutional and that the entire act should be repealed. You didn't propose alternatives, you simply wanted it gone. Millions of Americans with pre-existing conditions would have lost their protections. How is that supporting vulnerable Americans? The first crack in Bondi's composure began to show. Her voice took on a slightly sharper edge as she responded. George, you're mischaracterizing my position. We always believed that states could handle healthcare better than the federal government. Florida had innovative programs that were working. Stephanopoulos immediately pounced on this claim. What innovative programs? Florida had one of the highest uninsured rates in the country during your tenure. Your state refused to expand Medicaid, leaving hundreds of thousands of low-income Floridians without coverage. How exactly was that innovative? The question hit its mark. Bondi's pause was barely perceptible, but Stephanopoulos caught it. When she finally responded, her tone had become noticeably more defensive. We were exploring market-based solutions that would provide better care at lower costs. The federal approach was a one-size-fits-all mandate that didn't work for Florida's unique demographics. Market-based solutions, Stephanopoulos repeated, his skepticism evident. Can you name one specific market-based solution your office implemented that expanded healthcare coverage for uninsured Floridians? Another pause, this one was longer. Bondi's media training was clearly being tested as she searched for a response that wouldn't further expose the weakness of her position. George, we were working with private insurers to develop innovative coverage options that would have been more affordable than the exchange plans. Stephanopoulos sensed blood in the water. His next question came quickly, not allowing Bondi time to fully recover. Working with private insurers to develop options, or actually implementing programs that helped real people. Because the data shows that during your 8 years as Attorney General, Florida's uninsured rate remains stubbornly high, while states that embraced the Affordable Care Act saw dramatic improvements in coverage. The tension in the studio was becoming impossible to ignore. Bondi's hands clasped together slightly tighter as she prepared to respond, clearly frustrated by Stephanopoulos' relentless fact. George, you're cherry-picking statistics to support a narrative. The reality is that Florida's economy was growing. Unemployment was dropping, and we were creating an environment where people could afford healthcare through good-paying jobs. Stephanopoulos immediately seized on this pivot attempt, so your healthcare policy was job creation. That's your answer to someone with diabetes who couldn't get insurance because of a pre-existing condition. Get a better job. The bluntness of the question visibly rattled Bondi for the first time in the interview. She appeared genuinely caught off guard. Her response came out more heated than she likely intended. That's a completely unfair characterization of what I said, George. We believed in empowering people through economic opportunity, not creating government dependency. Government dependency, Stephanopoulos repeated, his tone growing more pointed. Is that what you call ensuring that a cancer survivor can get health insurance? Is that what you call making sure a child with asthma can see a doctor? Bondi's composure was clearly beginning to crack. Her voice rose slightly as she responded. George, you're being deliberately inflammatory. Nobody wanted to deny healthcare to cancer survivors or children with asthma. We wanted sustainable solutions that would work long-term, not political band-aids that would collapse under their own weight. Stephanopoulos wasn't backing down. If anything, Bondi's increasingly defensive responses seemed to energize him. Political band-aids. The Affordable Care Act has been law for over a decade. It survived multiple Supreme Court challenges, including the one you supported. Millions of Americans have maintained continuous coverage because of protections you fought to eliminate. How exactly is that a band-aid? The question hung in the air like a challenge. Bondi took a deep breath, clearly trying to regain her composure, but the damage was already being done. Her carefully prepared talking points were proving inadequate against Stephanopoulos' relentless questioning, and both the host and the viewing audience could sense her growing frustration. What came next would prove to be the turning point of the entire interview. Stephanopoulos could see that his healthcare questions had put Bondi on the defensive, but he wasn't finished. He was about to shift to an even more explosive topic that would push the confrontation to a breaking point. Let's move on to another matter, Stephanopoulos said, his tone remaining steady but his eyes sharpening. Your relationship with certain political donors during your time as Attorney General. Specifically, your decision not to pursue fraud charges against a certain university operation after receiving a substantial political contribution. Can you walk us through your decision-making process on that case? The change in Bondi's demeanor was immediate and dramatic. Her entire body language shifted, shoulders tensing as she realized where this line of questioning was headed. George, I'm not going to relitigate every prosecutorial decision I made during my tenure. My office handled thousands of cases, and every decision was made based on the evidence and the law. But Stephanopoulos was prepared for this deflection. This wasn't just any case. Pam, we're talking about thousands of complaints from students who claimed they were defrauded out of their life savings. Your office had been actively investigating, and then suddenly the investigation was dropped, just days after you received a large political contribution. Surely you can understand why people might question the timing. Bondi's response came quicker this time, her voice taking on a harder edge. George, you're implying corruption where none existed. Political contributions and prosecutorial decisions are completely separate processes in my office. I never, ever made a prosecutorial decision based on political considerations. Stephanopoulos leaned back slightly, but his gaze never wavered. I'm not implying anything, Pam. I'm asking you to explain a sequence of events that many found troubling. Your office was investigating, you received a contribution, and then the investigation stopped. Can you explain what evidence led you to conclude that thousands of consumer complaints weren't worth pursuing? The question hit like a hammer blow. Bondi's pause this time was impossible to miss, and when she finally spoke, her voice carried a note of barely controlled anger. My office reviewed the evidence thoroughly. George, we determined that the complaints fell under federal jurisdiction, not state jurisdiction. It was a jurisdictional issue, not an evidentiary one. Stephanopoulos immediately pounced on this explanation. A jurisdictional issue. Your office had been investigating for months. Are you telling us that your entire legal team somehow missed a basic jurisdictional question until after you received that contribution? That seems like either incompetence or something else entirely. The accusation of incompetence visibly stung Bondi. Her composure, already strained, began to fracture. More noticeably, George, I resent the implication that my legal team was incompetent. We had some of the finest attorneys in the state working in my office. Complex cases often involve evolving legal questions, and jurisdiction can be one of those questions. But Stephanopoulos wasn't letting her off the hook. Evolving legal questions. Pam, consumer fraud cases have pretty clear jurisdictional guidelines. Either the fraud occurred in your state and affected your residence, or it didn't. This isn't constitutional law we're talking about. This is basic consumer protection. What exactly evolved? Bondi's hands were now visibly clasped tighter, her knuckles slightly white as she struggled to maintain her professional demeanor. George, you're oversimplifying a complex legal matter. There were federal agencies already investigating, and we determined that they were better positioned to handle the scope of the allegations. Stephanopoulos' response came with surgical precision. Federal agencies that ultimately did nothing. Is that the federal expertise you're referring to? Because those students never got their money back, and no criminal charges were ever filed. So either your office could have helped them and chose not to, or the federal agencies you deferred to failed them completely. Which is it? The question created what felt like the longest pause of the interview so far. Bondi was clearly struggling to find an answer that wouldn't further damage her position. When she finally spoke, her voice carried a note of frustration that she was no longer able to completely mask. George, not every case results in criminal charges. That doesn't mean the system failed. Sometimes the evidence doesn't support criminal prosecution, even when people feel they've been wronged. My job was to follow the law, not to satisfy public opinion. Stephanopoulos sensed he had her cornered. So you're saying there wasn't enough evidence for criminal charges, but there was enough evidence for your office to investigate for months before you received that contribution. What changed about the evidence? Pam. Bondi's response came out sharper than she likely intended. George, you keep coming back to this contribution as if it was some kind of smoking gun. Politicians received thousands of contributions. The idea that every prosecutorial decision can be tied to a campaign contribution is absurd. But Stephanopoulos was ready for this pushback. Politicians do receive thousands of contributions. You're right, but most politicians don't receive contributions from organizations they're actively investigating. And when they do, most politicians return those contributions to avoid even the appearance of impropriety. You didn't return the money, did you? The question landed with devastating effect. Bondi's pause was so long this time that the silence became uncomfortable. When she finally answered, her voice had risen noticeably. The contribution was legal. George was properly reported, and it had no bearing on any prosecutorial decisions. Stephanopoulos pressed his advantage. Legal and ethical aren't always the same thing, are they? You could have returned the money. You could have recused yourself from the case. You could have appointed a special prosecutor. You did none of those things. What? Bondi's composure was now hanging by a thread. Her response came out heated and defensive. Because there was no conflict of interest, George creating a narrative that doesn't exist. My office followed proper procedures, and I stand by every decision we made. The host's next question would push the confrontation to its absolute breaking point. Proper procedures. Pam, your own staff members reportedly raised concerns about the case being dropped. Are you telling us that your own attorneys were wrong to be concerned? For the first time in the interview, Bondi looked genuinely rattled. Her voice, when she responded, carried an edge of desperation. I'm not going to discuss internal office conversations. George, attorney-client privilege and executive privilege protect those communications. Stephanopoulos immediately recognized the weakness of this response. Attorney-client privilege with your own staff. Executive privilege for a state attorney general. Pam, those privileges don't apply to conversations about prosecutorial decisions with your own attorneys. You're a lawyer. You know that. The legal technicality had been called out, and Bondi knew it. Her response came out flustered and angry. George, I'm not going to be lectured on legal privileges by a journalist. My office operated with the highest ethical standards, and I'm not going to sit here and have my integrity questioned based on conspiracy theories and innuendo. The word integrity seemed to hang in the air like a red flag, and Stephanopoulos was not about to let it pass unchallenged. What happened next would become the defining moment of the entire interview, the point where professional discourse completely broke down. Integrity, Stephanopoulos repeated slowly, his voice taking on a tone that suggested he was about to deliver a knockout blow. Let's talk about integrity, Pam, because I have here a timeline that shows your office sent subpoenas to the university. In question, your staff was preparing for depositions, and witness interviews were scheduled. Then you received that contribution, and within 2 weeks, everything stopped. Not transferred to federal authorities, not handed off to another agency, just stopped. Is that the integrity you're referring to? Bondi's face flushed visibly as she realized that Stephanopoulos had done his homework far more thoroughly than she had anticipated. Her voice, when she responded, was barely controlled. George, you clearly have an agenda here, and you're twisting facts to support a predetermined narrative. I will not sit here and be ambushed with selective information taken out of context. But Stephanopoulos was relentless. Ambushed. These are public records, Pam. Court filings, subpoenas, depositions, schedules, all matters of public record. The only thing selective about this information is your willingness to address it. So let me ask you directly, did you personally make the decision to halt the investigation? The direct question left Bondi with nowhere to hide. Her response came out defensive and evasive. Prosecutorial decisions are made collectively in my office. George Slitner, I don't micromanage every case that comes through our doors. Stephanopoulos immediately seized on this contradiction. You don't micromanage every case, but this wasn't just any case, was it? This was a high-profile investigation involving thousands of your constituents and millions of dollars in alleged fraud. Are you telling us you weren't personally involved? In a case of that magnitude, Bondi was now clearly flustered, her carefully constructed responses falling apart under the pressure. Of course, I was briefed on major cases, but the day-to-day decisions were made by experienced prosecutors who understood the legal complexities involved. The host's next question came like a guided missile. So you're saying your experienced prosecutors, who had been building this case for months, suddenly decided on their own that they had no jurisdiction, without any input from you, after you received a substantial contribution from the very organization they were investigating. Bondi's composure finally snapped completely. Her voice rose to nearly a shout as she responded. George, enough. You're conducting a witch hunt based on coincidence and conspiracy theories. I came here for a professional interview, not to be subjected to this kind of character assassination, but Stephanopoulos remained eerily calm in the face of her outburst. Character assassination. I'm asking you to explain your actions as a public official using public records. If that feels like character assassination, perhaps you should examine your actions, not my questions. The response seemed to stun Bondi into a momentary silence. When she finally spoke, her voice was shaking with barely controlled rage. How dare you? How dare you question my service to the people of Florida? I spent 8 years fighting for consumers, fighting for victims, fighting for justice. I will not have my record distorted by someone who has never held public office, never made the difficult decisions that come with public service. Stephanopoulos' response was delivered with devastating.com. Fighting for consumers. Pam, you just spent the last 20 minutes unable to explain why you stopped fighting for thousands of consumers who alleged they were defrauded. You've been unable to explain why you kept money from an organization you were investigating. You've been unable to explain why your office suddenly discovered jurisdictional issues only after receiving political contributions. That's not fighting for consumers, that's fighting for contributors. The accusation hung in the air like a thunderclap. Bondi sat in stunned silence for several seconds, her mouth slightly open, as if she couldn't believe what she had just heard. When she finally found her voice, it came out in a rush of barely coherent anger. I have never, in my entire career, made a prosecutorial decision based on political contributions. The insinuation is not only false, it's defamatory, and I will not sit here and listen to these baseless accusations any longer. Stephanopoulos leaned forward slightly, sensing that he had pushed her to the breaking point. Then explain it, Pam. Explain the timeline. Explain the decisions. Explain why thousands of students never got justice, because right now, the only explanation that fits the facts is the one you don't want to hear. Bondi's response was pure fury. The explanation is that we followed the law. George, we made decisions based on evidence and legal precedent, not on the political narratives of hostile journalists who are more interested in creating controversy than reporting facts. But Stephanopoulos wasn't backing down. Hostile journalists, I'm asking you questions that any reasonable person would ask about these circumstances. If that makes me hostile, then perhaps the problem isn't with my questions, it's with your answers. The exchange had now devolved into something resembling a verbal brawl. Bondi's professional facade had completely crumbled, and she was operating on pure defensive instinct. You know what, George? This interview is over. I came here in good faith to discuss my record and my qualifications, not to be subjected to this kind of ambush journalism. Stephanopoulos' voice remained steady, but there was steel in it now. The interview is over when I say it's over. Pam, you came on this show voluntarily to discuss your record. Your record includes these decisions. If you can't defend your record, maybe you shouldn't be seeking higher office. The statement seemed to hit Bondi like a physical blow. Her eyes widened, and for a moment she seemed genuinely speechless. When she finally found her voice, it was barely above a whisper, but filled with venom. You have no right to determine my fitness for office, George. That's for the voters to decide, not for partisan journalists with obvious agendas. Stephanopoulos' final response in this section would set up the dramatic conclusion. You're absolutely right, Pam. It is for the voters to decide, and they deserve to have all the facts about your record when they make that decision. That's what journalism is supposed to do, provide voters with the information they need to make informed choices. If you find that threatening, perhaps you should ask yourself why. The question about why she found factual journalism threatening seemed to pierce through Bondi's anger and hit something deeper. For a moment, the fury in her eyes was replaced by something that looked almost like panic. She realized that her emotional outburst had been captured on live television, and the implications were sinking in. I don't find journalism threatening, George, she said, her voice now noticeably quieter but still trembling with residual anger. I find biased attacks disguised as journalism threatening to our democratic process. There's a difference between asking legitimate questions and conducting an inquisition designed to destroy someone's reputation. Stephanopoulos sensed that she was trying to regain control of the narrative, but he wasn't about to let her off the hook. An inquisition. Pam, I've asked you to explain public records and defend public decisions. If explaining your actions as a public official feels like an inquisition, that says more about your actions than it does about my questions. Bondi took a deep breath, clearly trying to compose herself, but the damage was already done. Her attempt at regaining her professional demeanor only highlighted how completely she had lost it moments before. George, I have always been transparent about my record. I have always been willing to defend my decisions. But I will not participate in a character assassination disguised as an interview. The host's response came with quiet intensity. Character assassination requires me to make things up about your character. Pam, I haven't made anything up. I've presented facts, timelines, and public records. Your character is being judged by your own actions, not by anything I've invented. This seemed to hit Bondi like a slap across the face. She sat in silence for several seconds, and when she finally spoke, her voice carried a note of defeat that hadn't been there before. You know what, George, you've made your point. You've gotten your sound bites. You've created your controversy. I hope you're satisfied with what you've accomplished here today. But Stephanopoulos wasn't interested in her attempt to claim victimhood. What I've accomplished is holding a public official accountable for her record. What you've accomplished is showing the American people how you respond when asked to defend your decisions. I think that's valuable information for voters." Bondi's response was barely audible. "I think we have very different definitions of accountability." George, the host, leaned back slightly, his tone becoming more measured, but no less pointed. "My definition of accountability is simple. Pam, when you take public money to serve the public interest, you should be able to explain your decisions to the public. When you can't or won't explain those decisions, especially when they appear to benefit your political contributors at the expense of the people you swore to serve, that's a problem." The summary of her failures seemed to deflate Bondi completely. She sat in her chair looking smaller somehow, the fight having gone out of her entirely. "I served the people of Florida faithfully for 8 years. George, I'm proud of my record, and I'm proud of the work my office did to protect consumers and uphold the law." Stephanopoulos' final series of questions would deliver the coup de grace. "Proud of your record? Let me ask you this, Pam, if your child had been defrauded by that university, if they had lost their life savings based on false promises, and they came to your office for help, would you be proud to tell them that their case was dropped because of jurisdictional issues that suddenly appeared after the university made a political contribution to your campaign?" The personal nature of the question seemed to hit Bondi harder than anything that had come before. Her voice when she answered was barely a whisper. "That's not what happened, George." But Stephanopoulos pressed on relentlessly. "Then what did happen, Pam? Because you've had 30 minutes to explain it and you haven't been able to give me a single coherent explanation for the timeline of events. You haven't been able to explain the jurisdictional issues. You haven't been able to explain why you kept the money. You haven't been able to explain anything except that you're angry that I asked." Bondi sat in silence, her hands now folded in her lap, looking down at them rather than meeting Stephanopoulos' gaze. When she finally looked up, her eyes were filled with something that looked like resignation. "I think this interview has run its course, George," she said quietly. "I don't think anything productive is going to come from continuing this conversation." Stephanopoulos nodded slowly. "You're probably right, Pam, but I think the conversation has been very productive. I think the American people have learned exactly what they needed to learn about how you handle accountability, how you respond to legitimate questions about your record, and how you define public service." Bondi's final response was delivered. With what little dignity she had left, "The American people will make their own judgments. George, they don't need you to tell them what to think." The host's closing statement was delivered with quiet finality. "You're absolutely right. They'll make their own judgments based on what they've seen here today, based on your record, your explanations, and your responses to questions about both. That's exactly how democracy is supposed to work." As the interview concluded, the silence in the studio was deafening. Bondi sat motionless, clearly processing the magnitude of what had just occurred. Stephanopoulos had methodically and systematically dismantled her defenses, exposed the weaknesses in her record, and captured her complete meltdown on live television. What had started as a routine political interview had devolved into a masterclass in investigative journalism, with Stephanopoulos demonstrating exactly how to hold public officials accountable for their actions. Bondi's inability to provide coherent explanations for the most controversial aspects of her record, combined with her emotional breakdown under pressure, had created a moment of television that would be analyzed and discussed for years to come. The confrontation had revealed not just the specific failures in Bondi's record, but something much more damaging: her complete inability to handle accountability when the stakes were high. For a politician seeking higher office, there could hardly be a more devastating revelation than the inability to explain and defend the very record on which she was asking voters to judge her fitness for office. This explosive interview shows us exactly why tough, persistent journalism matters in our democracy. When public officials can't or won't explain their decisions, when they break down under basic questioning about their record, voters deserve to see that. What did you think about Bondi's responses to these questions? Did Stephanopoulos go too far, or was this exactly the kind of accountability we need from our journalists? Subscribe for more analysis of political confrontations, and let me know in the comments what other interviews you think deserve this kind of deep dive examination.